In this video, let's take a look into important HTTP status codes. So these are the important HTTP status codes that we frequently use while developing REST APIs. So client makes a HTTP request and server responds to the request with status codes indicating that the process of the status of the request. Well, let's understand these important HTTP status codes with an example. 200 OK. So 200 OK status code indicates that the request is successful and response content is returned to the client as appropriate. Okay. So 200 OK status code indicates that request is successful and response content is returned to the client as appropriate. Let's understand with an example. So consider we have Postman client, and from the Postman client we can make a REST API call, and this is the REST point URL to retrieve a collection of blog posts. So choose get HTTP method here and just call this REST API, and here we go. So server basically return a response with status code 200 OK. It means that this 200 OK status code indicates that the server has processed this request successfully and server return the response to the client as appropriate with status code 200. And if we make another REST API call, that is to retrieve a blog post with ID 1, the server will basically process this request and it will return a response back to the client with status code 200 OK. It means that the request is successful and client got appropriate response from the server. Okay, great. Next is 201 created status code. So this status code indicates that a request is successful and a new resource is created. Well, let's understand 201 created status code with an example. So look at here, we are making a REST API call to create a new blog post. We use post HTTP method here to create a new resource. So let's call this REST API to create a new blog post. And look at here the status code. So this blog post is already exists. So let me quickly change. Yeah. And look at here the response of the REST API. Alright, the server basically process the request and it will return a response with status code 201 created. So look at here the status code 201 created. So this status code indicates that the request is successful and new resource is created. Okay, so for example, we just made a REST API call to create a new blog post, right? That is to create a new resource. So server basically respond with status code 201 created to the client. Alright, just remember 201 created status code indicates that a request is successful and a new resource is created. So next is 400 bad request. 400 bad request status code indicates that server failed to process the request because of the malformed syntax in the request. The client can try again after correcting the request. For example, if client made a mistake while passing a request parameters to the REST API, then server will basically process the request and it will send a error response back to the client saying that client should pass the correct request parameters. Well, let's understand more about this status code with an example. So look at here, this REST API, that is create new blog post REST API, has some validation. If we remove title and if we hit send button here, so look at here, the client passed invalid title. Okay, that's why server responded to the client with status code 400 bad request. Okay, so whenever client passes invalid parameters in a request, then server should validate the request parameter and server should return 400 bad request to the client. It means that client should correct a request and it will try again to call the REST API. For example, if I again pass the valid title, something like REST API post, and if I hit send button here, and here we go, client got a successful response from the server. All right, great. Now let's understand 401 unauthorized status code. So this code indicates that authentication is required for a resource. The client try again with appropriate authentication. So if client try to access any resource which needs authentication, then server will basically respond to the client with status code 401 unauthorized. It means that client has to authenticate before accessing the protected resource. Let's understand with an example. Consider we are creating a new blog post. We are calling a REST API to create a new blog post, and in authorization we provide basically the credentials. And in this example I have used JWT token here. If I pass invalid JWT token and try to call the REST API, the client should get 401 unauthorized. Alright, so this REST API is basically protected, and this REST API needs authentication. So if client try to access this REST API with invalid authentication, then server should respond to the client with the status code 401 unauthorized. It means that client should pass a valid token here, or valid authentication. Okay, so just remember 401 unauthorized. It means that client try to access the resource, it needs authentication, but client doesn't provide appropriate authentication to access this REST API. Okay, great. So let's take a look into the status code 403 forbidden. So this status code indicates that server is refusing to respond to the request even if the request is valid. Well, 403 forbidden status code is similar to 401 unauthorized, but 403 forbidden is basically status code used whenever client tries to access unauthorized the resource. For example, if resource is protected with some authorization and client tries to access that protected resource, then client should get 403 forbidden status code from the server. Now let's take a look into the status code 404 not found. 404 not found status code indicates that requested resource is not found at a location specified in the request. Okay, let's understand 404 not found status code with an example. So consider we are making a REST API call to delete a particular blog post with ID 32, and this blog post 32 is not exist in a database. Okay, let's make a REST API call from the Postman REST client here, and look at here, this blog post that is blog post with ID 32 is not exist in database. Hence server responded a client with the status code not found. Alright, so whenever a resource not exist in a database or in a location, specified location, then server should return a status code 404 not found to the client. Okay, great. Now let's take a look into status code 500 internal server error. So this status code indicates that a generic error message, and it tells that unexpected error occurred on the server and that request cannot be fulfilled. Let's understand more about this status code with an example. So consider we are calling a REST API, that is sign in REST API here, and the username and password is ramesh@gmail.com, password is password. So this is the normal user, and hit send button and we will get a JWT token in a response, and we just copy this access token and just call create new blog post REST API. Before that, just pass this token in authorization header. Okay, so we have just logged in with the Ramesh user, right? And Ramesh user don't have permission to create a new blog post, but even though client tries to call this REST API with the Ramesh user, then the server basically respond a status code 500 internal server error to the client. Okay, so 500 status code indicates that a generic error message and given when no more specified message is suitable. Alright, just remember 500 internal server error. So this status code indicates that there is something went wrong at a server side, and that's the reason server responded with the status code 500 internal server error to the client.